So we expected this week to be bringing you an updated report on the retrial of Michael Colluci, the Somerville jeweler accused of murdering his wife back in 2015. He stood trial once already. That ended in a mistrial. The retrial was scheduled to start this week, but it was postponed. But the big story this week out of South Carolina, the suspicious supposed suicide of Micah Miller, the pastor's wife from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I am joined today by Lauren Taylor, our resident legal expert, guided us through the minutia of the Murdaugh hearing earlier this year. Lauren, thank you so much for joining.
Of course. Happy to be here, Will.
Things doing well? You doing well?
Oh, yeah. We're busy. Staying busy for sure.
Awesome. Lauren, you've got offices all over the state. You see cases like this. I know you stay a lot busier than most of us, but have you had time have you followed this Micah Miller story at all?
Well, thankfully, your news organization has done a really good job of keeping everyone up to date. I'm definitely not on every single minute detail, but I've got an overall understanding of, unfortunately, the circumstances surrounding the case.
Yeah, very tragic, and a ton of questions, a ton of unexplained factors tied to this case. It seems like the questions are outpacing the answers based on what we're seeing from the original reports. I want to, because you've got such a broad legal background and knowledge of these issues, I wanted to ask you about some of the legal questions tied to this case, getting away from the investigation. A few days after this story broke, lawyers on behalf of Micah's family members, particularly her sister, Sierra Francis, they filed a motion seeking to have the sister appointed as a special administrator. The pastor, J.P. Miller, is now challenging that. What exactly is this debate that we're seeing, and how does that relate to the divorce that was going to take place had she lived?
Right. So in this state, if you die married, then your spouse has what's called an elective share, and that will survive after your death. Unless you have a separation agreement that's already been signed and is an order of the court, that's typically how these things are going to progress. Obviously, Micah Miller, to my understanding, had only recently filed the paperwork asking the court to grant her what's called in this state an order of separate support and maintenance until you've reached the 1 year of living separate and apart together. So she would not fall under that normal, umbrella where there's already a separation agreement that's been approved. It's just awaiting, for the 1 year timeline to come up. So her sister, filing that is certainly going to be interesting to see how that plays out. She's going to have to obviously supplement the record with some sort of proof that maybe he was related to the cause of her untimely demise, or, if he aided in some way. And I think that is going to be kind of, running side by side with, we talked about earlier, the possibility of a wrongful death lawsuit arising out of this. So, we see cases at the criminal level recently where I think it was a couple years ago where we had the girl that bullied the kid into committing suicide, and she was literally, texting him saying, do it. And she was held criminally responsible, meaning she went to jail and had to serve, time in prison. The civil side of things is obviously a much easier burden to achieve. We're going to go through the same breakdown and analysis as we would in any kind of normal personal injury case. So you've got, a duty, a breach of that duty, a causation, meaning but for that breach, this would not have happened, and then damages is the final prong. So it's going to be, I think that the standard has opened up a lot more for these types of actions, especially with wrongful death. And the fact that it's not criminal, at least not yet, no one is, throwing that out there. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that litigation is really formed, meaning how the complaint is formed, what type of evidence are they going to put forward. I've seen some screenshots that your, publication has put forth. I'm sure there's much more damning things that haven't been released to the public, and it tells me that he might be anticipating this wrongful death litigation coming forward because he's already retained a lawyer just to issue a blanket statement to the press that, if anyone is defaming him or calling him an abuser, that there will be, subsequent things that could be filed to address that. So
he's threatened to sue everybody. Yeah.
Right. And I would like to not get sued. But I think that he knows this isn't over. And while he's undoubtedly very relieved by, the findings of the report and the 911 call coming out, along with the video of her at the pawn store, I think that certainly clears him from a criminal standpoint. He probably hasn't put a lot of thought into what could happen on a wrongful death, but I'm assuming the lawyer that he's retained out of Myrtle Beach is hopefully advising him that this is where that train is going.
Yeah, but
as of
you and
right
I
now.
remember we spoke. It was a month or so ago about the case in Michigan with the parents,
Right. The
and
Crumley case.
those were criminal charges. That wasn't just a wrongful death; they were criminally convicted.
And they didn't pull the trigger.
Ugh.
They didn't possess the gun. So like I said, we've seen a lot of these cases really push the envelope for how far are we going to go when holding someone liable when something happens. He didn't put the gun in her hand, but did he drive her to that point? And without his actions, would she still be here today? That's going to be the crux of the wrongful death lawsuit. So I'm definitely going to keep an eye on that. This case for me has a more personal tone because this is what my office deals with mostly every day. Family law is the primary area of law that we practice in. So if I had a client that came to me making the allegations that Micah Miller's friends and family are making about JP Miller, I would have to really sit down and caution them. Anytime there's someone that's coming forward with not just physical abuse, but mental abuse allegations, a divorce is like a death. And especially when it's somebody so young as she was. And I know there have been allegations of grooming and all of that, but neither here nor there. She was still a very young woman in a marriage with someone that had a lot of power in his church, power in his community, as a businessman. So just those scales were not equal at the beginning, even when the marriage was perfect, right? There was an inequity there. When those behaviors start to show up, it's a psychological game that really has to be played perfectly by the abused victim, unfortunately. So the first step I would do is get counseling. Your friends and family are great, but they sometimes don't provide the best advice, or they act out of emotion because they care about you and they're not thinking about what the best way to set this up in a legal world is. So getting a therapist is always the first step. The second step is, which I believe Micah Miller was attempting to go forward with, is what's called an order of protection. So in this state, an order of protection would relate to anyone that's living under the same home together. And the elements that you would have to meet there is that you are in an imminent fear for your safety being in the home with that person. It's the strongest protective order in our state that can be issued against a spouse. Now, it's still a piece of paper. If he does contact her, if he does violate that order, police are going to have to come, and hopefully they get there before something horrible can happen. But that's the first step. In order to make sure that that order is successful, you need to go dark. You need to have a plan to where you can go somewhere where they can't find you, they can't contact you, there's no posting on social media. You instruct your friends and family to do the same so that they're not able to easily access you, which is what happened with Miss Miller. I believe this wasn't the first time she attempted to file and leave the home. And then there were instances where she was finding razor blades in her tires and things like that. I have no
Trackers
doubt.
under the car.
Trackers under
Yeah.
her car. So I have no doubt that she intended for him not to know her location, but whether a friend or family member shared that or she unknowingly posted something on social media, he obviously was made aware of that. Getting your evidence together in any family court case, because unfortunately that's all we have. You can get in a fight with your husband every day of the week, but if you're not calling the police and you're not going to the hospital or taking photos of your injuries, it's a he said, she said game in family court. And unfortunately, sometimes people say really awful things in family court that are just completely not true for whatever motives they may have. So the more proof you have, that's what I would tell people. Keep a journal, get all of your screenshots, everything from your phone, because you're going to get a new phone too, by the way. We need a new number. We need a new email address. People always forget about the email addresses. And then it's logged into a device that they have access to, and now they know you set up a new bank account, and
They
here's
took all those steps, and the
the one
yeah.
mistake can really start you over from the beginning. So as much as this is a tragedy, I think it's shining a light on the fact that this is happening everywhere. And it's not just happening to preachers' wives or people that are getting the publicity that this case is getting. Domestic violence, especially in the state of South Carolina, is one of the highest in the country. It's something we've, struggled with. In fact, in this state, you can't even get divorced as a woman if you're pregnant at the time, whether it's your husband's baby or someone else's. So we have a lot of archaic laws that are unfortunately not designed to always protect the victims. And I think that's the saddest part about this case, was that she was doing everything she could to get away and to take those steps. And she must have just, what I can imagine, felt an utter sense of overwhelming that I can never escape. He'll always find me. I can keep doing this and it'll just keep happening over and over again. So if you are a woman or friends with a woman or a man that is experiencing this type of abuse, it's really important to have a support system behind you, a plan in place that you do not deviate with and you do not share with anyone else except your extremely close family member or friend that you will need, as a resource, and really try to get yourself the mental help you're going to need to come out of this. So hopefully, if we learn nothing else from this, it's women are more empowered to take the steps they need to protect themselves and their own mental health and, get out of situations that aren't helping them.
Absolutely. And you talked about collecting evidence and being prepared to
Right.
Present that evidence. But one of the saddest things about this case is that we've learned, or at least it has been alleged, that she was doing that.
Right.
He had her involuntarily committed, and during the time she was committed, basically, according to her friends and family, swept all of her devices, searched all of her belongings, and basically took all of the evidence that she had accumulated.
Unfortunately, that is another. I've had a client have that happen to her as well. In this state, a family member or someone that lives with you can call and say, I think Will Folks is going to hurt himself or someone else. And they will pick you up and do a 72-hour hold where they'll send you to a mental evaluation. And unfortunately, it's not well known, I guess, and I certainly don't want to inform the public to use this as a strategy because I think it's not going to work for you. But a lot of people have used that as a strategy to say, okay, well, if I can get my spouse committed and make it look like they have a mental health issue, then I have a better argument that they're not fit to care for the children, or I should be in charge of the bank accounts and the investments because we can't trust her. And I think that was the claim he made, about her vehicle, that she, would have these fits of rage where she'd spend all this money and he was afraid she was going to sell the car and spend the money. So all of those things come, but the more proof you have, unfortunately, it does look like she had everything she could have at that point, and it wasn't enough. I think, the mental health side of it, maybe if she had the help of a therapist or a psychiatrist, they would have been able to give her that missing piece. But it's an unfortunate situation that we'll never really know the depths of what was said. I'm sure we'll uncover more if a wrongful death lawsuit does come out, because they will be able to engage in discovery and see all the messages that were sent to him or her. And if we find messages that are similar to that other case where the girl was bullying him and encouraging him to do it, I think he's going to have, some serious things to consider legally going forward. So that will be interesting to see how it develops. And I'm sure your website will get them first.
A lot of folks doing a lot of good work. Daily Mail's been on this.
Oh, yes.
The local TV outlets have actually done a really good job. I've been impressed with all the coverage from all different corners on this. News Nation has done excellent work. By the way, News Nation, get this girl on your air. She knows her stuff. One more thing on this Miller case before we move on to the Colluci. I know we want to talk about the Colluci case, but I wanted to ask you this. You talked about dealing with this, so many clients. Is this a common thing, the kind of harassing, the controlling, manipulating finances, manipulating, is this something you see frequently in the cases that you have to deal with?
I certainly don't see it to this level. Everyone that comes into my office, we joke, they're always like, do you have experience working with a narcissist? And everyone thinks that they're married to a narcissist. I think that there's varying degrees of that, okay? I've absolutely dealt with, I don't want to put anybody in a box, but it more likely does tend to be controlling husbands that, are like, I'm going to make the rules to this. And if we're getting divorced, it's going to be on my terms. And I'm going to pay only this much, or I'm going to do only this much. Now, at the end of the day, the law is the law, and how the judge applies the law to the facts that are presented to them is how it's going to be. But that doesn't mean that person can't, financially bankrupt them or, hold them hostage under a situation where they have no access to credit cards and, the electric's cut off of their $2 million home, or, their kids, the water is cut off. So now they look like the bad parent because their children are going to school dirty. This is a type of psychological warfare that I personally do not practice. I don't practice law that way. I don't advise my clients to engage in that type of behavior. I feel like it always rises to the top at some point because there's a guardian that's going to be appointed if you have children. They're going to investigate and see who's really the primary parent and who's taking the kids to school and doing all of that. But yes, it does happen. And unfortunately, a lot of women are believing what they're told when the husband says, you're not going to get anything, or I'm going to take the house and the kids, and you're going to be left with nothing because of X, Y, and Z. A lot of my job is kind of unraveling that ball and saying that's not how things are. Just because your husband told you that doesn't mean that's what the judge is going to do. And similarly with men, we're starting to see, the tides change a little bit more with men, where they're in a situation where their wife maybe is holding financial power over them, and they feel like they don't have, the entitlement to be able to access the bank accounts or the credit cards. And, anytime you're holding finances over someone's head, it can feel like life or death, especially when your children are involved in your ability to care for them. So we take it all very seriously, but we try to practice law and aid our clients through it with like an ethical tone to it so that we're never on the bad side of that.
Absolutely. You did mention the archaic system, and, in South Carolina, the goal of the family court system continues to be reconciliation.
Yes.
And in so many cases, we see this. That's not the answer.
Yes.
And it's evident immediately that that's not the answer, and yet the system continues to push that.
Well,
outcome.
I think, if you go back to like overall theories of like society, benefiting from marriages, they, traditionally produce children and we keep the population and all of that. That's a bigger issue. But yeah, I used to joke with Letitia Verdon, who is now running for our Supreme Court, when she was a family court judge, I would say, if they made you date a year before you could get married, like they make you stay separated for a year before you can get divorced, I bet we would have a lot less divorces in this state. And I think that's still true to this day. But yeah, we're one of the states that we make it very hard for people to walk away from a marriage. So keep that in mind when you get married or get a prenup.
True. Letitia Verdon, by the way, an amazing judge, certainly would make an amazing justice.
Yes,
so we'll
keep
our eyes on that election as it moves forward. I want to shift gears. Obviously, we've been talking about the Miller case, where there are all of these allegations related to this spousal relationship. And let's talk about the Colluci case, where there's an alleged murder to come from the deterioration, collapse, whatever you want to call it, of that relationship. Lauren, you've been following this case. You followed the original trial.
That's right.
We were obviously scheduled to go to trial this week, and at the last moment, we hear that it has been continued. Were you surprised by that? Did you see that coming?
I was surprised by that. As we learned with Murdaugh, like whenever we have these cases that are going to attract a lot of media attention and are going to be complex, the docket has to be cleared because they need to make sure they have enough time to actually hear the case and there's not a mistrial because, it's Friday and we didn't get to 3 witnesses. So usually ahead of time, especially in a case like this that's a retrial, you would look at how long the first trial took and then add a couple extra days to it, even if you don't have any new witnesses, just because there's going to be a lot of referencing that first trial record that the attorneys are going to have to keep continuously going back to, and that's just going to eat up court time and slow things down a little bit. So I was shocked by that because I thought the administration would have, had more of a discussion with the AG's office and Andy Savage's office and say, this is how much time we think we're going to need, because it's not easy to go find that time somewhere else. All of these cases are backlogged, from COVID. We're still having this case happened in 2015. The trial originally happened in 2018, but, we're getting almost a decade now since the original
They only
incident.
budgeted a week.
Exactly, a week, which I think the original trial took 6 days.
8 days,
8
and
days.
then the deliberation.
Right, so you would at least need, I would say at least that long plus another couple days just for, like I said, the housekeeping stuff that's going to come up. There's going to be a lot of in chambers discussions where the jury is excluded because they're going to want to reference something that was referenced in the first trial. And although I believe the judge is the same as the first trial, there might be different extenuating circumstances that have arisen that might indicate she'll rule differently in the second trial. So there's going to be a lot of housekeeping. It's going to be more boring, at least for some of those issues, but then we're going to dive right back into it. And with having a new Kinley and I actually went to law school together, so I'm excited to see her on the AG side and really flexing those muscles I know she has, and see if she can put forth a different strategy than the previous attorneys for the state.
Right before the continuance was announced, there were a flurry of motions filed by the defense looking to exclude certain evidence, testimony, and even trying to hamstring the prosecutors in the words they can use. Lauren, you looked through those motions. As you were reviewing them, what stood out to you? Is the defense going to be able to eat away at the prosecution before this thing even starts, this retrial?
Well, that's always the goal. And whenever you're filing motions in limine, that's just a fancy word for saying limit. We don't want this evidence to come in. And, the reasoning behind most of these motions was relevance, saying it's not relevant, it's going to be prejudicial to the jury, meaning like whatever relevance it might have to whether he did or did not kill his wife, the probative or prejudicial value of it just being a bad fact is going to change their opinion. And they might, be more swayed by the fact that he allegedly uses drugs and alcohol to excess and allegedly, is not good with his money, and maybe he's not the best dad, and maybe he wasn't the best husband. All of those things, when you look at it in a circumstantial case, they're not going to make you like Mr. Colluci. So they're trying to limit that so that they don't have to deal with their client or the jury not liking their client as much. And I don't know how effective that's going to be just by the nature of these people's lives and how they lived. And I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it, and I do family law, so it's definitely up
quite
there. Quite chaotic, to say the least. And you just released how Sarah Colluci's first husband died, which, as I was watching the replay of the first trial, Andy Savage mentioned that he was, stabbed 27 times, and I paused and rewound and texted you, and I was like, wait, why don't we know about this? And you were like, I have no idea. And then to find the answer, which you'll have to read Fitsnews to do, it was shocking. But yes, so one of the things that I thought was a really good strategy on the part of the defense and what they mentioned is they don't want to use the word victim, homicide, confession, struggle, anything like that, because those words, like, a jury is just sitting there like little sponges absorbing all this stuff, right? They don't have their phones. They can't play on social media. They can't play Wordle or whatever. So if you're just sitting here hearing, murder, victim, confession, homicide, struggle, those words over and over, those words evoke a tone in your mind of like evil, bad person. And that's going to lead you a couple steps closer to a guilty verdict that maybe you wouldn't have gotten to if you were hearing things like Mrs. Colluci and how she perished or passed away, instead of she was murdered, or this is a
incident homicide,
or crime scene, I believe, is another one that they don't want used. So I thought that was a really good strategy on the part of the defense. The one that gave me a little bit of pause, and I will admit that I have not gotten this far in rewatching the first trial, so if anyone's going to catch me, it's going to be on this thing. But one of the motions that Andy Savage and his team filed was to not mention the necklace. And I believe the state's theory in the first trial was that there was a necklace Sarah Colluci was wearing, and that necklace was used to strangle her, and that's what actually killed her, not the supposed garden hose. Well, during the first trial, I guess while Mr. Savage is demonstrating this necklace to the jury, it breaks.
He broke it.
He broke it. And so he filed a motion in limine to not have the necklace discussed, but also not to discuss how it was broken. In my mind, and again, I don't know every single fact associated with this particular incident, but I would argue that, like, hey, this isn't even strong enough to withhold me dangling it in front of the jury. How in the world can it strangle her? It's much more likely that it was the garden hose, versus this flimsy little necklace. So I don't know if there's something else that he's worried about coming out with that, but that one was the only one that gave me a little bit of pause. And then, every other motion just led to more questions. They don't want to talk about his financial status. Why? They don't want to talk about his drug and alcohol use prior to the date of the incident. Why? They don't want to talk about his relationship with his children. Why? Or the funeral arrangements. I mean, so sometimes he's boxing the prosecution in so much, or attempting to box them in so much, that they're not going to be able to paint as colorful of a picture as they would otherwise like to. And as you saw in the first trial, Andy Savage's strategy, which has worked very well for him, is that of a, good old boy, like someone's father or grandfather, and he's just asking questions. He just wants
help
to
me understand.
Help me understand. Explain this to me. I'm just a dumb lawyer that doesn't know anything, and I'm just trying to figure it out, Judge. And so I think that humbles him to the jury and makes them more amenable to listen to story time versus
very different from the Murdoch lawyers.
Very different from Dick and Jim, who were, up there, I'm telling you, and I'm telling you again, and I'm telling you what I told you. Andy's tactic is very different. And, he doesn't have to win this case. He just needs one juror to say, I don't know. I don't know. And that's a win for him. And that's going to be the state's hardest barrier to overcome, is the crime scene or the incident scene is difficult. And I know when I was watching it, sometimes court TV would not pan when the exhibits were being shown. So I couldn't see exactly, the building and where the fence hit it and all of that. But I think that's going to be the part that whenever you have a circumstantial case, you're essentially painting a picture of the jury and saying, this doesn't make sense, right? Mm-hmm. We can all agree this doesn't make sense. It didn't happen.
Reasonable assumptions.
Reasonable doubt, yeah. And so I think combating that and Kinley really having to keep her strategy in check and not fall into some holes that Andy Savage might lay for her. I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of the young up and coming superstars versus the old guard and how that's going to pan out. I'll be following.
Well, I want to ask you. Well, I hope you'll be following. I hope we'll get you down there, and we'll be talking about this as it happens. But I wanted to ask you this: you talked about those motions about the defense eroding the state's case. It's important to point out at the end of this first trial, there wasn't a question of guilty of murder versus not guilty. The jury, according to reports at the time, were considering manslaughter or not guilty. So the state, at least in the first trial, clearly didn't do the job. Let me ask you this, based on everything you've seen in this case and watching the first trial, what do they have to change to get it right this time, to get the conviction the second time?
I think you can think about it two different ways, right? In my mind, for them, an involuntary manslaughter conviction is still a win. He's still convicted of a crime. He's off the streets. So I would say the more options you give a jury to say, find him guilty of something, check one of these boxes. And that starts with how you lay your case out. If you lay your case out only to meet the elements of homicide, then you're gonna leave a lot of people at the door because they're gonna say, I can't get on that bus with you. I don't think you've met that burden. We don't have, physical evidence to give me that concrete feeling. But when you're looking at circumstantial evidence, that's a whole different thing. And so painting that story and getting them, to believe that version of events doesn't make sense to me. And if they can all agree on that, then you're going to have a lot easier of a chance of swaying them into a murder, or a homicide conviction versus an involuntary manslaughter.
Do you think the prosecution may have reached a little bit in the first trial?
I think that you always want to go for the highest one. Now, the best prosecutors sprinkle some foundation in there to kind of cover themselves so that they say, okay, if you can't get here with me at the top, let's find something. We can't let him walk. Let's find something that we can at least agree we've met the elements of that crime. So that I would be more cognizant of embracing the involuntary manslaughter and say, look, I don't know what happened. The only person that knows what actually happened that day is Michael Colluci, and he's sitting right over there. We can sit here and guess all day long. Did she go outside to pee? Did she intentionally do it? Was it because of her husband? Was it because of a fight? We are never going to know that answer. There's not enough evidence to definitively answer that question. So then the rest of it is, what makes sense? What do you think happened? And unfortunately for the state, a lot of those questions are going to be answered by what the jury learns about the defendant. And that goes to his financial state, his drug use, his relationship with his children, his relationship with his wife. All of those things are relevant to think, is this person capable of doing this? And that's what the jury's got to get to. They have to know this man and get in his head and say, do I think his version of events of what happened is what happened? And if they don't, they have to convict.
Wow. Well, it is a circumstantial case, as you said, and obviously we had mentioned the Murdaugh lawyers earlier. There's another Murdaugh connection here.
Mr.
David
Owen.
Owen, the lead investigator in this case, who was also the lead investigator in the Murdaugh case. He took some hits during the Murdaugh trial.
He did.
Do you think that's going to come back into the Colluci retrial?
I would bring it up if I was Andy Savage. But I would also say David Owen, I wouldn't want to be him. He has been through so much with both of these cases. He's got to be thinking, how did these two happen, so close together? But I think it's definitely going to be relevant, unfortunately. And in all of these cases, there are going to be mistakes made. I know this one, the biggest thing is I don't think they even visited the incident scene until a year later to investigate, if what he said was even physically possible. So I think there's always going to be mistakes. The best thing for, David Owen to do is just to admit what was done incorrectly, let the air out of the tire, give Andy Savage what he's looking for with that, answer the questions honestly, and then just keep rolling. You can't change what happened a decade ago and what was done in the investigation, but it will hurt the state's case more if you're trying to over-explain or justify in some way. There's always going to be things done wrong in an investigation. Just own it, lay it out there, and then answer the questions as asked and try to move on the best you can.
Terror is human.
Everybody's human, exactly.
Well, Lauren, cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come in here. These are two incredibly complex, complicated cases, one of which is literally just 2 weeks old. Your ability to assess them and to dive into some of these key legal fights that are coming, just amazing. We're so grateful you're willing to sit with us. And
always.
You'll be with us for Colluci when the
I will
retrial
be there
goes
with
down?
Colluci. Yes, it's in Berkeley, so closer than Columbia for me.
Heck yeah. Lauren Taylor, everyone. Lauren Taylor Law offices all across South Carolina.
That's right.
Look them up. Thank you once again, Lauren.
No problem. Thank you, Will.